I'm very excited to start this next portion of our programming today. There are quite a few exciting things happening, but I have to say one of the things that's garnered the most excitement is what's about to happen right now. And to get us started, I want to introduce someone who has many titles. He is a university attorney at the Mississippi State University, Director of Compliance. He is also an HLS alum, class of 2004. That's right. But most importantly today, he's the coach of this fantastic team. So let me introduce you to Brett Harvey.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you, everybody, for being back here this afternoon. We had such a great civil and informative exchange among experts this morning. I gather you all came back because you're ready to see a fight now, and we will do our best to oblige on that front. Of course, there are going to be a lot of thank yous here. I'm sure these guys are going to do their own thanking, but just very briefly, on behalf of Mississippi State University, on behalf of our debate team, on behalf of all of these folks, and myself, just wanted to say a heartfelt thank you to Harvard Law School, to Dean Amanda Watson, and to all of the folks working with her to make this happen. It's a tremendous opportunity for our students, and I will say, just on a purely personal note, as an alum, it is a particular privilege to be here at this particular point in history at a celebration of a document that is so instrumental in the limitations of the excesses of government. I think, while I do speak for myself, I think a lot of us are as proud as we've ever been to be alumni of Harvard and of Harvard Law School in particular. So, on that note, today we will be debating the proposition, Magna Carta remains a valuable guide for constraining the power of government. For those of you in the audience who are big Magna Carta fans, understand the sides were assigned. They didn't choose them. So to the extent they have to say things that differ with our worldview on this, they are being good sports about it. Briefly, the times for the debate, for people who care about such things, each of the speakers will have 7 minutes for a constructive speech, after which they will be cross-examined by their counterpart on the other side. And then following the constructives and all of the cross-examinations, each debater will have a 4-minute rebuttal speech with the hope of getting you out of here in just about an hour. So very briefly, let me introduce the debaters we have. And just to be clear, they're representing a team of over 30 debaters at Mississippi State that has 2 consecutive team national championships under its belt, and any of them I think could have done an excellent job here, but these are 4 of the best. So let me briefly introduce them. We don't have to tell you where they're all respectively from, because while we have team members from across the country and around the world, all 4 of these are homegrown talent from the great state of Mississippi. So we will start near the middle with the first proposition, Sam Harvey. Sam is a freshman biochemistry major, already a 2-time national champion in the pro division, and I won't get into the details, there's 2 ways to win a national championship, and he won both. He is the only one on the panel not planning to attend law school. He wants to be a doctor one day. So we can also dispense with their career plans. The second proposition will be Devin Hutchins. Devin is a recent 2025 grad, philosophy major, having won individual national championships in the team and professional divisions. The first opposition on the other side will be Hannah Daniels. Hannah is a 25 grad as well in business, economics, and Spanish, so covering all of her bases there, and a national champion in the team division. And finally, on the second opposition is Ben Harvey. He is a sophomore math major and the current president of the team, with his national championship having come as the top speaker in the team division. So they are all very accomplished debaters. And what they have to say is a lot more interesting than what I have to say. So without further ado, we will hear from the first speaker on the proposition.
All right, like my coach said, and also my dad, we do have our own thank yous, in particular to Harvard Law School and Assistant Dean Amanda Watson for allowing us to come here to have this debate, to be in front of so many scholarly individuals. It is extraordinary, and we appreciate that you're all listening and giving us this time and this opportunity. With that, I'm going to get into this first constructive. 810 years ago, King John affixed his seal on Magna Carta to avoid imminent civil war provoked by his failures. He'd levied excessive taxes, spawning public outrage. He'd neglected to provide a charter of concessions to his barons, and he had fought a doomed war against Philip II of France in a frivolous land grab. King John was a failure and an incompetent monarch, a fact for which we should all be grateful. Without his shortcomings, Magna Carta might never have been written. Sometimes it takes the most vindictive, incompetent, mendacious, and corrupt of leaders to awaken complacent people to the realization that something must change. In the course of this debate, my partner Devin and I will prove that Magna Carta remains a valuable guide for constraining the power of government. The discussion we're having is an important one, so to avoid falling into the minutiae, it's best to clear up an important phrase. This definition has been agreed upon by both teams. The term valuable guide in this context refers to having a positive influence on modern-day social and legal developments. With that, we get into the first major reason as to why the Magna Carta remains valuable, that being the world it created. A number of rights are perceived by modern society as fundamental and inalienable, but the notion that common citizens would have rights which even the highest authority of the land cannot violate is far too often taken for granted. We owe a great number of our most fundamental protections to Magna Carta. In the UK, 4 clauses still stand as official English law. According to the Parliament, those are what they refer to as part of Clause 1 and the entirety of Clauses 13, 39, and 40. 39 and 40 now being in the superior Magna Carta, as it has been revealed to us to be, Clause 29, which states, "No free man shall be seized, imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, exiled, or ruined in any way, nor in any way proceeded against, except by the lawful judgment of his peers and the law of the land, and to no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay right or justice." I'm not the first person to read these today, but I think that it's important to reiterate them. Now, our opponents at this time are likely gearing up to point out that there are many other clauses like the perfectly safe fishing weirs clause, so we'll recognize that perhaps not every clause is readily and easily connected to the modern day. We need not prove that each and every clause is immediately significant and helpful. Instead, I'd say it's our opponent's job to prove that any of these extraneous clauses actually causes some substantial harm instead of just pointing out that they exist. But I digress. To have at no cost to you the right to have your alleged crime investigated, to have not only the guarantee of a trial in which you are able to defend yourself, but also that this trial must be held with some speed. These things, among innumerable others, are without question inherently valuable from the Magna Carta. But they are further enhanced by their being among the first rights guaranteed not by, but in spite of a king. This principle is what makes Magna Carta so salient then as well as now. It is the genesis of the idea that any sort of citizen could kind of take the king when he broke the law and punish or admonish him in some way. Now we move to the second large reason, the world that the Magna Carta ended. Most of the greatness in the Magna Carta is found not in the path that it paved, but in the path that it radically and abruptly shuttered. In just 63 clauses of the original Magna Carta, the Charter had turned the notion of absolute rule on its head. Amusingly enough, the barons hardly knew this. Magna Carta was more of a laundry list of grievances than it was some treatise on government. For lack of a better word, it was a huge middle finger. Magna Carta was nothing more than a forceful cease and desist letter. Still, the document soars above its station. It was the commanding force for liberalism and remains the source code for liberty. But why? 2 reasons: its audacity and its deception. The Charter marked a watershed in medieval politics. King John was brought under the rule of law. Power was no longer vested in him. It was now vested in a set of legal principles and customs that required upholding. The king was no longer a sovereign. He was a regent of the law. The divine right of kings was forcefully and permanently weakened. What follows is a dramatic shift, and here comes the deception. The Charter didn't establish the barons, although the Charter was for them, as the creators of law. Instead, it attributes the origin to God. Clause 61 reads, in part, "Since we have granted all these things for God, for the better ordering of our kingdom, and to allay the discord that has arisen between us and our barons, and since we desire that they shall be enjoyed in their entirety with lasting strength forever, we give and grant to the barons the following security." These 2 factors are what make it such a powerful symbol that is still relevant in the modern day in the fight against tyranny. And so we move into our third and final reason, that being that the Magna Carta is dearly needed. We've established what it's done, but what can it do for us? The Magna Carta has served as the scaffolding for the experiment in liberal limited government, but the structure is beginning to buckle. In practically every liberal democracy across the world, the winds of authoritarianism are picking back up. Faith in our strongest institutions is withering. We now live in a world where political angst has given a blank check to anyone with the charisma to convince the people that they can reverse perceived decline. Here in the United States, the fruits of the Charter are being seriously challenged and questioned by the most recent administration, where our president has said that he doesn't know if we are to offer due process to everyone in the United States, and his deputy chief of staff has said that the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended and that their administration is looking into this. These are grave issues and point out that we must resurge this most valuable document. But these developments are hardly unique to America, nor are they unique to democracies in the Anglosphere. In Hungary, in Poland, and in fact in the European Union at large, major rights groups decried the dismantling of the rule of law through clever attacks on checks and balances. With the resurgence of the notion that our rulers may have, by God or by force, an absolute right to rule however they choose, the Charter gains new force. There are still tyrants to be toppled. Our Charter, the world's charter, Magna Carta, will always be the North Star of liberty. It will always, in its audacity and bareness, remind us of the soul and spirit of our mission. It is the enemy of tyranny and the power of whim. It is the champion of true liberty and prosperity. It lives to halt the King Johns of the world, and in our time, there are many. That is why we must never let the flame die out. Long live Magna Carta. Thank you.
It's on. Okay, 3 minutes. Are you ready?
Yes.
I'll begin now. I'd like to first start off by saying that was a great speech, and you remind me of a true British patriot, despite having been born in our nation capital. Anyway, I'd like to start with one clear question, and it's about your relationship with the Magna Carta and due process. Now, it seems like you're saying that the Magna Carta invented due process, or at least popularized it beyond repair. Is that the claim that the proposition is making? Or if it's not, what is the relationship that the Magna Carta has to due process today?
The claim is of popularization, in particular through the ability to enforce due process. We saw in customs, in documents of old, that there were notions of due process, but what we have with the Magna Carta, as we've seen in previous panels, is the ability to enforce it through law, through writs,
Sure.
or through the threat of excommunication.
So let's be very clear. You're not saying that the Magna Carta invented or even popularized to a certain degree due process. You're saying what's important is the enforcement mechanism for that due process.
What I'm saying is the popularization and the access to due process through the ability to enforce offered by Magna Carta.
But if we can be clear, it is the enforcement mechanism, right?
Yes.
Okay, so
At
what
its
was that
essence.
enforcement mechanism?
So in the original document, that would be Clause 61, which we heard earlier today was removed when we saw further. But we also heard that we were able to look to writs of law, and that we were able to look to the Pope for potential excommunication of the king to enforce this law.
Right, but the most formal form of constraint, the enforcement mechanism, that was Clause 61, right?
Originally.
And which we've heard was removed from the Magna Carta after 1215.
Yes, because it would be improper to allow for legal revolution.
So then what was the enforcement mechanism after that?
It was exactly what I told you. It was
All right.
these writs of
Well,
law.
we'll move on and talk about that just a little bit later. Right, so if the Magna Carta constrained King John, then why was he so easily able to appeal to Pope Innocent III and then have it annulled?
Well, I think it speaks to the fact that he even felt that it must be repealed, that it was so powerful, and that it was something that he was scared of. In the past, it would just be that he didn't want to enforce it, he was king, and so he didn't.
Right, but if it were going to enforce him, if it were going to take his power as a king and basically divide it up to this group of 25 or so barons, an elite class of people, then why was someone other than that class of people able to take it away from them?
I would say that it's because at a certain point you have to do your best to avoid these things which take power. And so King John was doing his best to protect himself, to shield himself.
And then final question, let's bring it to the modern day. Let's say that, like, hypothetically, there was some U.S. president that decided that they were going to ignore orders of due process in a hypothetical world, and they were going to just, not to do that. What would the Magna Carta tell us to do today? How does it guide us in this present situation? What's the enforcement mechanism?
In the modern day, it would be to remove him from office.
Right. I mean, but how are we going to do that? Who's doing that? The 25 barons?
As many barons as necessary, I'd
Well,
say.
how many barons would that be?
As many as necessary.
All right. Well, thank you very much. No further questions.
Thank you.
All right. So Sam, that you just heard, is an incredible speaker. I want to say a huge thank you to him. I don't know if I'll be quite as good of a speaker as him, but hopefully I'll have some arguments that can make it up to you. It's such an honor to be invited to this event, and being able to debate one of the world's most legally influential documents at this historic school, especially in front of the world's experts on the subject, is an immense privilege. I want to extend a huge thank you to Harvard Law School and Assistant Dean Amanda Watson for welcoming us here and asking us to be a part of this incredible event. Discovering an original 1300 copy of the Magna Carta at Harvard is incredible, and as the opposition, we will acknowledge the profound impact and history that the Magna Carta is credited with. However, perhaps like a group of disgruntled barons, we have the uphill battle of telling you that today that does not matter. And we're going to tell you that no, the Magna Carta does not remain a valuable guide for constraining the power of government. Now, I was a little afraid I was going to be the first contrarian in the room today, but I want to thank Professor Donahue for getting that out of the way for me by suggesting that Harvard should get rid of the Magna Carta. Hopefully that'll make this speech go over a little bit better. So the first reason the Magna Carta does not remain a valuable guide for constraining the power of government is simply that it was not novel when it was written. The Magna Carta was not this massive novelty for society at the time, and you're going to hear my partner Ben get up here and tell you that throughout history and throughout the world, we see documents that actually echo the same ideas the Magna Carta does. But I want to take a chance to look specifically at England. England is a great example of this because England had been creating similar documents for the past 115 years. I'm of course referring to coronation charters. The first documented example of this was the Charter of Liberties signed by Henry I in the year 1100. And these charters stated that the king vowed to follow the law and correct past injustices that had happened before he was king. So why does this matter? The affirmation is going to get up here and tell you the Magna Carta matters because it was revolutionary, because it broke new ground. And they're going to tell you this is the document that changed England into a place with fair trials and a place with concrete checks on government power. And we're going to disagree that it was the single Magna Carta that was able to accomplish this. Like the charters before it and the iterations of the Magna Carta that came after it, it contributed to small incremental change when it came to developing rights in England. When it comes to things like due process, we can't attribute all the developments we've made simply to this document. We wouldn't attribute the erosion in the Grand Canyon to a single day of weathering, and we cannot attribute all the developments we've made towards rights like due process to singularly the Magna Carta. Now, the second point I want to bring up is simply that it was a treaty and not a template. Unlike documents like the Constitution, it was a temporary solution to a temporary problem, that problem being King John. King John was known for constantly abusing his power, and you heard my opponents tell you a little bit about that in their very first speech. The barons were tired of his abuses of power, so they marched their militias and they threatened King John until he agreed to a list of their demands. These demands were, of course, what we know as the Magna Carta. Rather than being created to make some kind of overarching philosophical statement about the legal system, the Magna Carta in many cases is very specific, and we heard some of those very specific clauses when it came to things like fishing or when it came to things like knights' fees. These specific clauses remain completely unrelatable to our world as we know it today for the most part. And maybe more importantly, the Magna Carta does not do anything to stop some of the more pressing issues democracy faces, like majoritarianism. If the barons and king agreed on a policy, even if only the barons agreed on a policy, and even if it went against the spirit of the Magna Carta, there was no one else to hold them accountable. If their policies hurt everyone else in society other than themselves, there was no common person that could get up under the Magna Carta and tell them to stop. So what does that mean? We wouldn't say that a world where a group of governors gathered up militias and had a bunch of riches, and they made a list of demands to maybe the US president for less regulation of AI or lower taxes. We wouldn't say that's a particularly strong way to constrain government power, or an example of how we should do it in the future. Concentrating power in a small group doesn't actually guarantee that the rest of society is represented. Now, the final point I'm going to give you is it's a flawed guide. And I'm going to tell you a couple reasons why this is true. But the first is the original Magna Carta did not apply to everyone. It applied almost in its entirety, with some exceptions to this, to free men. So free men would have been men that owned property. This represented a really, really small fraction of society. And it meant that the things we know the Magna Carta to be iconic for, things like due process, did not apply to everyone. And so not only could you as a common person not do anything if it was violated, you didn't get these rights in the first place. Even at the time the Magna Carta was created, no one claimed it was the perfect guide to limited government. In fact, maybe this is why the document was reissued and reconfirmed 50 times throughout its history. Eleanor Janega, in her article, "The Magna Carta Will Not Save Us," says, quote, "The fact that it was reconfirmed 50 times is a bit of a giveaway, and that it was almost totally ineffectual and largely ignored. Laws that everyone agrees to usually don't have to be reaffirmed dozens of times." And I absolutely agree. If the Magna Carta was so revolutionary, it would not have followed the pattern of the many charters before it, making very small steps that had to constantly be defended and changed. The final reason this guide is so flawed is because a guide that lets you go anywhere is extremely dangerous. I want you to imagine that, let's say a supposed group of insurrectionists, they wanted to find a justification to commit acts of violence and property destruction. A document like the Magna Carta gives them that exact justification. Why? Rather than establishing a court system or a system of checks and balances, the Magna Carta states in Clause 61 that if the king does not follow the treaty, the Committee of 25 Barons can, quote, "distrain and assail him in every way possible." Anything could be justified by wording that vague. In fact, a group of protesters in 2021 claimed that their rights had been violated, their Magna Carta rights, and they seized Edinburgh Castle in Scotland, citing Clause 61 of the Magna Carta as their justification. The Magna Carta has never been law in Scotland, by the way, but this is a perfect example of what happens when a document has this kind of ambiguity. Clause 61 was used again by businesses in 2020, hoping to avoid COVID closures. It led to fines for those who tried to take advantage of what they thought were their Magna Carta rights, simply referencing a vague procedural section about who the barons can dispute to. And again, we wouldn't all say that businesses staying open during COVID was particularly helpful for the time. And this is the problem with the Magna Carta. In a world where people are encouraged to do their own research on whether vaccines or seances work better against diseases, or where the president constantly repeats fringe legal theories to his followers in the Supreme Court, what do we expect to happen if we endorse a document that's not clear about the rights it does and does not entail? And perhaps more importantly, a document that at least arguably says the remedy for any violation is essentially rounding up the militia and going to war with the government. So because the Magna Carta lacks the uniqueness we attribute to it, because it cannot protect everyone, because it provides few rights to the people it does protect, it cannot be the Northern Star we turn to limit government power. Oh yeah, you might need the mic.
All right, trying to make sure that this is good volume. All right, Hannah? All right, go ahead and begin. Obviously, that was an excellent speech. It's always wonderful to see you debate, and for all of you who are getting this privilege for the first time, you should be honored. She's one of the best debaters I've ever known. With that, I do have a couple of questions that I need to ask you. The first being that you mentioned the coronation charter of Henry I. Can you tell me how the coronation charter was ever enforced, if at all?
There wasn't an enforcement mechanism. I mean, the only one you could pretend maybe was an enforcement mechanism was the fact that peasants could revolt, but I mean, they could do that with or without a coronation charter.
All right. The next question that I have for you is that you mentioned, aside from the coronation charter, a great many charters that existed in English history. Would you, for me, account for the difference in how we regard the Magna Carta compared to these many charters in terms of historical significance?
Yeah, so I think the reason we think of the Magna Carta as important as we think of it today is because of how it's been used throughout history. I don't think it was necessarily the wording of the Magna Carta that made it unique, although some people may disagree with me on that front. I think it was the fact that it was referenced back to as this kind of like symbol and myth of liberty and freedom. And so it's not that the Magna Carta, the document, is what really saves us, it's the will of the people trying to use that Magna Carta as a way to defend their own rights and freedoms.
All right, and then is it the opinion of the opposition that that would have happened, that the spirit of the people would have persisted sans Magna Carta?
I would like to think so, yeah.
All right. The next question that I have for you is that you mentioned the very specific clauses talking about knights' fees and fishing weirs. Can you tell me what direct contradiction that they might have with such important clauses as 29 and those governing specific things like due process and human rights?
So, human rights isn't something that the Magna Carta really references unless you're referencing specifically due process. But when we talk about a valuable guide, I think it's important to look at all of the parts of it. I wouldn't necessarily take a children's book, add it on to the end of the Bill of Rights, and say, here you go. You have a little bit of irrelevant bits, but the rest of it makes sense. And in the same way, we can't consider something to be a wholly valuable guide or a North Star, as you put it, if it doesn't have parts that are entirely helpful and useful.
All right, then my next question is actually quite relevant to that. Would you say that perhaps the Constitution of the United States is a more fitting guide in the modern day?
Yeah, I would say so.
Then how do you account for something like the Third Amendment? Have you been nearly forced to quarter troops in your own home?
No, but I think that's because of the protections of the Third Amendment. I don't think while some things like night fees are relevant anymore, I think it could absolutely be a possibility, although I would hope not, that someone asks you to quarter soldiers for free in your home. I know America has a fondness for the military, so I could imagine a world in which they might ask you to do that.
My next question also pertains to the Constitution. Were there not representation issues when it was first drafted, considering many peoples and a particular gender that was not considered represented under the Constitution?
Yeah, no, I mean, you're correct. There were a lot of people left out of the original Constitution. But when we say Magna Carta, the Magna Carta we're often referring to is the original Magna Carta, the 1215 Magna Carta. And when we say Constitution, the one we're often referring to is the Constitution as we know it today. The Constitution as we know it today does not have the flaws that you pointed out the Constitution had when it was originally created.
All right. Thank you very much, Hannah.
Thank you.
Okay. Everybody hear me well? Okay. Fantastic. I'll go ahead and start right now. I'd like to echo what everybody else has said already, which is to say thank you so much to Harvard Law School, to all of you wonderful people to coming out, and of course, thank you so much, Assistant Dean Watson, for having invited us to this event to hear the opinions of experts on this subject and to be able to talk one last time, debate one last time with some of my best friends and colleagues. Now, that being said, I do have to disagree with Hannah. She's a very nice person, but I have to tell you why exactly everything she just told you is completely wrong. So the first thing that she talks about in establishing why the Magna Carta is no longer some sort of relevant, guide is that it wasn't novel. It wasn't even relevant at the time. It wasn't something new. She tells us this because she looks to things like due process, which had already been established in England at the time or in other charters. But my response to this is, well, we don't have any indication that certain rights like due process or habeas corpus were actually written down in those other charters that she mentions. In fact, it was my understanding that they weren't written down, that they were poorly carried through. They weren't really well enforced or executed. And it was whenever we had the Magna Carta that these things were standardized and made to be uniform. But not only this, but none of the charters that my opponents talk about or might bring up later have any kind of enforcement. That only comes through with the Magna Carta. And so when they tell you that actually the Magna Carta was just another day of weathering in the Grand Canyon, it wasn't. None of that is a correct understanding of the situation. It was an earthquake. That's what happened. The second thing that they talk about is that the treaty was a peace treaty. It wasn't a template. And they say that this is the case because it was a temporary solution. It was mainly aimed at King John, but that's also not the case. And we know that because it was continually reissued by other kings, a fact that they're very keen to point out, and then also that it was aimed at preventing further kings in the future. When it lays out Clause 61 or other clauses that guarantee the rights of people or guarantee the enforcement mechanism, it doesn't say specifically, and of course this is only for King John, other kings can go ahead and do whatever they want to our freedoms and liberties. It says any king, any region, any person like that can be prevented from trammeling the rights of English freemen. The next thing that they say is this because there were a number of specific and petty clauses, that's what the peace treaty would have established and not some sort of grand treatise on government. But as we heard earlier today, most of these clauses that we conceive as being out of date or being really small and specific and petty aren't. They're actually quite relevant, right? Whenever we complain about the fishing wares in the Thames, that's not necessarily a commentary on current fishing law. That's a commentary on freedom of navigation that stretches on into the modern day, that still remains. When we have those conversations, we can extend the Magna Carta to address also free trade and tariffs and taxes. The next thing that they say here is also that it doesn't address majoritarianism. It most certainly does address majoritarianism. Because the Magna Carta doesn't say that the barons create the law, or that the king creates the law, or that the law is even in any way man-made. It appeals to a higher law, to a law that is universal, to a law that is above everyone, to a law that is, in their understanding, created by God. That was the understanding. If any law trammeled any of those rights or any of those protections, it would be unjust, it would be illegitimate, and the charter could be enforced. Their last point here is that it's a flawed guide, and I think this is probably the most important point. There are a lot of problems and lapses with the Magna Carta. It doesn't touch on everything, it's not perfect. But that's not Sam and I's point. Our point isn't to say that the Magna Carta got it all right 800 years ago, and we should all go home today and never respect any other charter, any other constitution, any other law. Our point is to say that when we look to our current constitutions, when we look to our current laws, when we look to the ways in which those things are being enforced, we ought to think back to the Magna Carta. Is the spirit of that mission, is the spirit of that charter still being honored? What they say here is that it didn't include everybody, right? That it really only protected freemen in England at the time, which would have, of course, extended not just to the barons, but to knights and petty farmers of the time. So it did go beyond the barons, but we'll certainly acknowledge that it was limited in scope. This is a problem, and it doesn't have to be the only charter we use. We can look elsewhere. We can look to more inclusive, to more specific, to more modern charters to guide our understanding of the way that the law should work. But I would argue that this imperfection in the Magna Carta, this lapse in coverage, is actually a good thing. That imperfection is what pushes us forward to try to perfect it. It is when we look back to the Magna Carta and we say, well, these rights are protected, or these groups are protected, and they're protected because of what the law should be, then maybe we should expand that to other groups. Maybe we should expand that to other liberties. That is the force behind the Magna Carta. So I would say that's not a problem, that is a feature of the Magna Carta. The next thing that they say here is that it was continually reissued. I have no issue with this argument. We think it's a great thing that the charter was continually reissued and understood by the British and continually enforced by the British. This isn't a subtraction from the charter. In fact, we get nothing from our opponents as to why these reissuances are harmful or subtract from the value of the charter. In fact, it's looking back at the charter, perfecting it, and creating such good, relevant, and new versions to the document that make it so good, and that continually give force to the document, that say that as a matter of tradition and not a matter of force, as a matter of consent and not as a matter of military rebellion, we are going to respect this document. That is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And lastly, they say that it justifies anything. And what we would say here is that it doesn't. The meaning of the charter is extremely clear. It is a charter that establishes a supreme law that nobody is above and that nobody can trample, that nobody can violate. And it says that within that law, there are certain protections for everybody in this room. That is the simplest understanding of the charter. But disagreement is natural. It happens. It's why we have courts in this country. It's why we have this great, big, beautiful law school in the middle of Cambridge, Massachusetts, because we want to train people to have the right interpretations and argue for that. So having disagreement is fine. And going over that disagreement is fine. But here's the thing, right? That disagreement, whatever it justifies, whatever course of action it allows people to take in their own minds, shouldn't prevent us from taking bold stances on liberty, from taking bold stances on the way that government ought to be prosecuted, on the way that government ought to be established. That is why we support the Magna Carta. That's why it still remains a valuable guide. Thank you all so very much. Thank you. Okay. How do you present this? Okay. 4 minutes, right?
Okay. 3.
Okay.
You ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get started. That was a really awesome speech. As always, you're a wonderful speaker. But I want to start off by just going back to the exact question that we're asking today. So how does the Magna Carta serve as a guide for us today? What is it guiding us to do?
So once again, it's a thing that we can look back to. It's a North Star. It's a lodestar. It is something that we can look back to and make sure that we are honoring its spirit. It's something that
Okay.
establishes liberty and it establishes the rule of law.
Okay, I think we'll disagree on a couple of those fronts a little bit later.
That's the
but
point.
Before we get too far into it, you mentioned the enforcement mechanism, and you say that's what makes it unique, is that it has an enforcement mechanism.
Yeah.
Would you mind telling me what that enforcement mechanism is?
So in the original charter, the enforcement mechanism would have been rallying 25 unknown barons to go against the king. Later on, that part of the charter is taken out, and that's replaced by writs of law or excommunication by the Pope.
Okay, but originally we're talking about barons basically going to war. Am I correct in saying that?
Sure.
Okay, so would you say today that if we disagree with our government, that it's justified for us to take up arms and go to war?
No, we should do what the charter later established, which was to have a peaceful and legitimate process of disagreement whereby we ask the government to do its job.
Okay, sure. So what were the barons doing if they didn't like the king before the Magna Carta? What would they do to try to enforce their will?
So they would, I guess, revolt.
Okay, so they didn't need the Magna Carta to be able to go to war against the king.
No, and we're not claiming that the Magna Carta invented conflict or invented war or invented
Sure.
rebellion. What we're claiming is that this set down a very, very, very clear line in the sand that if the king crossed would result in him being deposed. Something that mandated the barons enforce the law and something that mandated the king to execute the law.
Okay, but the Magna Carta wasn't perfectly enforced, correct?
Not at first, no.
Okay, you would say it's perfectly enforced. At what point did it start being perfectly enforced?
I don't really know that it ever was perfectly enforced.
Okay, yeah,
That's
yeah,
why it's a
just-
North Star. It's not something that we're using as a script in the modern day. If we had it all figured out, we wouldn't be having this discussion. We would just have it written down into our laws.
Okay, let me just move ahead a little bit.
Yeah.
So you talk a little bit about how it's imperfect at one point. You says it has imperfections, like the fact that it only applies to freemen. But then later you said that because it was reissued so many times, it perfected the document. So now we have a perfect document. So how do you reconcile those two?
Well, I didn't say that it was a perfect document. I just said that it was the best form of the document as it existed, and that we continue to shape our own charters. Again, we don't have the Magna Carta as statute in the United States, but we do have things that reflect it and reflect its spirit. And that is something
Okay.
that we can continue to perfect and make better and make more just.
What would you consider the spirit of the Magna Carta to be? You reference this a lot.
Yeah, so like I said in my response to your final point that you made, I said very clearly that what the Magna Carta does is it establishes a law above everybody, and that law establishes the rights and protections of everybody in this room.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, all right. 7 minutes, just like everybody else. I will begin now. I'd like to echo the thank yous that my friends and my coach have given you guys. It's going to get repetitive, but I'd just like to say thank you again to Harvard Law School and to our Assistant Dean, Amanda Watson. We're incredibly grateful to be here, and I'm grateful to be doing this alongside three people that mean so much to me. Devin's my best friend, Sam is my brother, and Hannah has been an invaluable guide to the team for the last couple of years, and it is extremely pleasing to be up here. Now, I'm going to do kind of the same thing that Devin did and just get back up and tell you why he's actually wrong and Hannah was right, and we're going to be right at the end of the round, and they're going to be wrong at the end of the round. And in order to do that, we need to talk about a couple of important ideas, mostly addressing what Sam said in his first speech. Now, the first main idea that Sam gives you when he's telling you that the Magna Carta remains a valuable guide, something that I imagine most of you are pretty partial to, is that the Magna Carta basically established due process, or for a more charitable, popularized due process. Now, the main claim that he's making here is because of the Magna Carta, we came to know due process today. It's said in Clause 29 that no, we will not deny justice, we will not sell justice. Every free man will have their case heard. It's basically establishing due process as we know it today. Now, my response to that, and Hannah's response as well, is no, that's not true. That's not what we come to know due process as today, and that's not what the Magna Carta did. Now, there's no need to get into the highly specific, nitty-gritty semantics of what the Magna Carta actually said. We've made it clear already that it only applied to free people. But it seems like our proposition is glancing over that fact. This is a document which they called the North Star, and at its very foundation, it says you get this privilege if you are part of this Barron's class. It was, in essence, a peace treaty. I really wonder how the people, the experts in the audience, react to us saying that, but that's fundamentally the proposition or the opposition's position. It's not that due process was novel and established in the Magna Carta because it existed far before. It was, in fact, basically has existed as long as written law has. If we look back to the Code of Hammurabi, recognizing innocent until proven guilty, that's a large component of due process. And because of its origins in ancient Babylon, with records basically as far back as written law goes, we understand that this is a pretty novel, or not a novel idea. And if we look back to the Charter of Liberties, signed in 1100 by King Henry I, as Hannah mentioned, this too was a predecessor to the Magna Carta, something that scholars were well aware of, something that they cited, something that they modeled the Magna Carta off of. And this also had its own conception of due process. But if you want to go across the globe, the Tang Code, established in 624 current era under the Tang Dynasty, had a much more comprehensive and interesting doctrine of due process. It told us how trials were supposed to be conducted, where we would use evidence, the job of the prosecution, witnesses, and accusers. And what this means is very simple. Due process is an intuitive thought that we will all have. Devin asks us, do you really think that the Magna Carta would have we would have established due process without the Magna Carta? Do you think society would be the same? And largely, Hannah and my answer is yes, kind of, because people have been thinking of it time and time again. It's intuitive to human beings that if you are going to be punished, they should probably have a good reason for doing that, and maybe they should hear you out. Because we've seen due process originate all across the globe, independent of Great Britain, even in 1215, we come to understand that this is the kind of idea that supersedes the rest of legal thought. It is the it did take place in the Magna Carta, and we do credit the Magna Carta with being very important, but it's not legally important because we understand due process from it. It's historically important because of the revolutions and other movements it was associated with. Now let's move on to the second main point that Sam gave you. He talks about the divine right of kings. He said that the Magna Carta's establishment rocked the divine right of kings. It basically said that King Bad John superseded under the rule of law, that he had to acquiesce, that he was governed under this treaty that outlined exactly what his powers were. It was important and novel because it showed us that all people are subject to the rule of law, even the king who is established under the divine right of kings. But this is actually not what the Magna Carta did. It wasn't rocked until Sir Edward Coke in the mid 1600s in his Institutes of the Laws of England basically said that the Magna Carta, he reinterpreted it and told us that the Magna Carta applied to all people. He used it as leverage to place King James I at the time under the rule of law. This was important because as Parliament had grown, as people had become more accustomed to getting representation across the king, specifically in Parliament, he needed a lever in order to cause King James I to submit, and that's exactly what it did to the divine right of kings. Now, in cross-examination, Sam and I began to discuss why was the divine right of kings still a problem 400 years later if the Magna Carta established this power over the king? And the answer is pretty simple. It didn't establish universal power over the king. Now, Devin says something pretty interesting. He says that the Magna Carta was addressed to all kings going forward, but that's actually not true. It's sort of a historical anachronism. The Magna Carta was written in the royal we. It was specifically for King John, and here's why that matters. When the proposition gets up here and they tell you that these are universal charters, these are universal principles of due process and rights for all being established and learned for the rest of history, acting as our North Star, that's not quite right. The reason that we understand the Magna Carta as we do today is because of the way it was rewritten over the course of history. Yes, it is valuable to understand due process, and none of us are contesting that. But the Magna Carta doesn't quite tell us that, and the opposition is going to continually tell us that this was actually a peace treaty. It was something between King John and his barons, and it's not a model for modern-day problems. Now, the final main point that Sam gives you is that modern due process is under attack, and I have to agree with him. He tells us that in the modern day, there are many important lessons that we can learn from the Magna Carta, and he does this by pointing out a couple of situations in which due process is not being exercised fully. He says that we haven't gotten it quite right, and he's 100% correct, but I want to get at the heart of this debate. Now, in cross-examination just now, my partner Hannah got up and she started to ask Devin, what does the Magna Carta tell us to do today? And it's from that question that we don't get a very clear answer from Devin. It acts as a guide, but what does that mean? It should inform us in our everyday, day-to-day lawmaking. Laws have become more complex. Lawmakers today are regulating AI, cryptocurrency, and international trade, and they are using governmental power all of the while. When the President of the United States ignores due process, the Magna Carta has no real solution, and it gets to this very important idea from Devin. It's that enforcement mechanism, an enforcement mechanism which hardly exists. When first Devin talks about enforcement mechanisms, he tells us Clause 61 and the Council of 25 Barons, but then he moves on to writs to petition the king to follow the Magna Carta. These were actually enshrined in the 1215 Magna Carta in Clause 16 and removed just alongside Clause 61. Why is this important? Because it shows us just how malleable the Magna Carta is. Any clause that was not appeasing to the king, any clause that didn't serve the immediate goal of consenting to taxation for barons was removed from the Magna Carta, and there was no real enforcement mechanism. That's why, as Hannah has told you throughout this round already, we have seen every situation where the barons wanted to reapply it, basically a bloody war, a revolution of some sort, because that's the real enforcement mechanism. At the end of the day, the Magna Carta is historically important, and that's undeniable. But when we ask about guides for today, we need to be looking for modern thought and modern actions. If we can't ask the question, what does the Magna Carta tell us to do, and find a useful answer, then we cannot affirm the proposition that it is still a useful guide. Thank you very much. It's all.
All right. Hello. Oh. I'll go ahead and start right now. Fantastic speech, as always. Just have a couple of questions. The first question is, you said that due process had existed before in things like the Tang Code or the Hammurabi Code, right?
Yes.
So in the Tang and Hammurabi codes, to whom do they attribute the source of your, I don't know, right to due process?
The source of, same thing as the Magna Carta. It's typically the god or the sovereign.
What do they say?
What do they say? The god or the sovereign. In the Tang Code, I believe that it was the sovereign of the land, and then in the Code of Hammurabi, they appeal to some higher religious authority.
Okay. Another thing I wanted to ask is, you said that the charter was meant for King John, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so then why did the barons, the self-same barons that create the Magna Carta, why did they pressure his heir to reissue the charter?
Oh, see, that's actually a historical anachronism. That didn't happen. His marshal, William, or his regent, William Marshal, was the one who pressured him. The king, he's the descendant of King John, he had actually beaten the barons. He had pressured them back. He had grown his military largely with foreign mercenaries. And as an act of magnanimity, he decided to reissue the charter, basically to quell the problems of the barons and show that he was a king that would respect the rights of his barons, quite not in line with King John.
Okay, well, let's say there's no pressure. Why did he reissue the charter?
Well, let's say that there's no reason. What's the reason? It's because of the pressure.
Okay, so he did pressure?
No, because of the pressure. Why was there? I guess I misunderstand the question. You're saying if there's no pressure from barons, why would he do it? Again, to appear kindly, to show that he is a baron that is going to respect the power, or he is a king that is going to respect the power of the barons. And maybe because he thought down the line there could be a future conflict, because that's what English history had shown us. Like, these rights were very regular: due process, hearing out your barons. And when that didn't happen, it was pretty typical for revolutions or violent conflicts to emerge. And so he was, I suppose, being more prescient in that sense.
Okay. So let me ask you, do you think that the Declaration of Independence might be a valuable guide today?
I think so.
Okay. So what does it say about cryptocurrencies or AI?
It doesn't say anything about cryptocurrencies or AI.
That's a shame. Okay. So what about the Bible?
The Bible?
Yes.
Oh, you're asking a tough question. I think the Bible is, yes, very important.
Well, for some people, I understand, but...
Yes, I believe it's an important guide still today.
Same question. Does it say anything about AI or cryptocurrencies?
As far as I'm aware, no.
All right. Well, yeah, well, those are all the questions I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right, and this is the point where the speeches begin to shift to be a little bit shorter. Each of them from now on will be 4 minutes long, and this will be the first rebuttal coming from the proposition. Starting now. I'd like to once again say thank you to the room, to everybody for being here. Y'all have been a wonderful audience, laughing at our best jokes, and I really appreciate that you keep us honest and make sure that you're only laughing at the funny ones. But with that, I do actually have to get into some substance. This will be somewhat of a defense. You heard from Ben just a moment ago exactly all of the reasons why the opposition believes that the proposition's core reasoning falls. And so my job is to protect. But first, I'd like to acknowledge a trend that I see kind of coming from the opposition. This phrase, perfect. Perfectly enforced, not a perfect guide. I take issue with this. I don't think that the resolution asks for the proposition to defend that Magna Carta is a perfect guide. It is that it is a valuable guide. And so there may be imperfections. The Constitution contains in it many imperfections. Their arguments contain in them many imperfections, a lot of them that I'm going to try my best to point out as this speech continues to move forward. And so I'll move on to the reasoning level debate. starting with that first major reason, that being the world the Magna Carta created. The biggest complaint from the opposition on this argument is that due process must apply to all. And to that I say it had to start somewhere. If only some portion of people were protected under Magna Carta, then the boon here is in that in some way somebody's rights were placed above the authority of the highest king, of the king of the land. It showed that it was possible for people to have rights that supersede this authority, that must be interfered with in the way of due process, as opposed to through just the whim of the king. And so that is the important foundational thing there. But also, I'd like to point out that when Ben provides you all of these examples of things like charters that existed previously, the Hammurabi Code, I'll bring you back to something I said in the very first case, which is that it is not by but in spite of the king that the rights are assured. It cannot just be at the king's leisure. The rights cannot be guaranteed by the king. They are guaranteed by something higher and in spite of the king's power, not because of it. Next, we move on to the second largest reason. The major argument against this second largest reason, that being the world destroyed, the fight against the divine right of kings, is that Ben complains that Edward Coke had to deal with the divine right of kings many hundreds of years down on the line. And to this, I point out that this is actually a benefit, that Edward Coke's struggles were with a fundamentally different issue on a separate scale than those against King John, but also that it proves the malleability of Magna Carta. And so when they complain that it is not applicable to the modern day, I would say that this is an example of exactly how we as a people are able to take this document to understand its core basic principles and apply them to any struggle that we may have. And so then finally, I move on to the third reason that we provide you, the most contemporarily significant one, that we dearly need the Magna Carta. Now, the biggest complaint here is that we do not have specifics on how to engage in the modern day world. And I'll address this really just by looking back to the questioning that you just heard, that the Bible and the Constitution contain no reference to some of the most contemporarily significant issues, such as AI, such as these tariffs, and yet we have a way to address them by looking at the most foundational principles. This is how we must use the Magna Carta. What we hear from the opposition is that they want a perfect script. They want a step-by-step guide. They want their hand held, and they want you to they want to be told where to put their feet. That's not how government exists. That's not how we are able to engage in a real functional system. We have to have a guide made up of principles. And at no point have I seen a convincing argument from the opposition that principles that exist in the modern day are easily found in some other document than the Magna Carta. If Ben wants to argue that, this due process is intuitive and we would have found it another way, well, I'd be glad to celebrate whatever document had created it in that world. But we have a world where Magna Carta is that document, and so we must celebrate it and use it. Thank you.
All right, everybody tired of me yet? Okay, I got at least one nod no, so I'll take that as a good sign. All right, if everybody's ready, this will be the last time you'll hear from me, and I'm going to start right now. Since it's the last time you'll hear from me, I want to say another huge thank you, and this time I want to make sure to thank all of you. Without you guys, it wouldn't be any fun to be up here debating about the Magna Carta, and without you guys, we likely would not have been able to come to Boston, which has been such a fun trip and such an honor to be able to attend this event. Now, what I'm going to do in this speech is I'm going to try to condense some of the ideas that you've heard about into 3 key points. I'm going to start with what's good about the Magna Carta, the things that my opponents like to bring up over and over again that they think are really important, and we'll probably agree on their importance, but we're going to disagree on the Magna Carta bit just a little bit. The second is we're going to look at what parts of the Magna Carta do they ignore? What parts of the Magna Carta are they conveniently leaving out to make it a little bit of a stronger case for them to use it as a modern guide? And finally, we're going to look at the harms. What harms do we face if we implement the Magna Carta as it is as a modern guide? And I'm going to argue that there's quite a few of those. Now, let's start with what's good about the Magna Carta. They give you 2 key benefits, and they say these make up the spirit of the Magna Carta, the reason that we all know it as influential today. And those are due process and no divine right of kings. Now, we're going to agree the divine right of kings, probably not good, and due process probably is good. However, these principles are not unique to the Magna Carta. As was established earlier today, and as we've established throughout the round, they represented a shift in society as a whole. Now, the Magna Carta is a great example of this shift, but it was not the only example of this shift. We see this shift happening throughout Europe. We see this shift happening in China. And we see as early as written law has existed that the right to prove whether or not you are innocent or guilty has existed alongside it. So we know that due process is not something unique to the Magna Carta, although we can all agree on its importance. And the second thing they state is the divine right of kings. I want to bring you back to something I said in my very first speech, because they tell you this gets rid of it almost entirely. You'll notice that the reason the Magna Carta was reissued so many times, at least according to the source I quoted, is because often it was ignored and not enforced. And they even concede that it's not enforced perfectly. So what does this mean? The divine right of kings wasn't magically gone in a day. We didn't write the Magna Carta and immediately get rid of it. Now, it was a step in this process, but so were the charters before it, and so were the versions of the Magna Carta that came after it. So were the writings of so many other people at this exact same time. Now, perhaps the more important point is what points do they ignore? In today's round, we're talking about the Magna Carta in its entirety and not just the parts that we all remember and like a lot. And the first thing they ignore is the irrelevant parts. Now, you heard my teammate Devin get up here and he told you that even the most irrelevant seeming parts are actually very relevant because they guarantee rights. And to that, I would ask, does the Magna Carta actually guarantee your right to freedom of navigation? And the answer to that would be a resounding no. It does say some very specific things about fishing, for example, but that doesn't actually guarantee you things like rights to free speech, although that can be implied by the document, which means we can't use it as a guide for actually creating the laws that we follow. The other thing they ignore are the bad parts, and you heard those a little bit earlier today. The fact that women cannot testify in murder cases other than their husband, that foreigners are not going to be let in, and some very oddly specific laws about Jewish people. And all of these laws are, again, something that we would be referencing as a guide if we reference the Magna Carta as our North Star. Now, the last and final thing I want to leave you with is the fact that they tell you at the end of the day that the Magna Carta is about the principle of the thing. And what I want to tell you in today's round is the principle can cause a whole lot of harm. What did we see happen when people take the Magna Carta in this vague wording and try to reinterpret it and use it? They don't use it in the perfect ways that my opponents describe. Instead, they try to raid a castle in Scotland, and instead they try to open up their businesses during a worldwide pandemic. These are ways we would all agree are probably bad and harmful for society. And if a document both does not provide all of the rights that common documents now provide, and also leaves room for people to take actions like these, we can agree it has enough harms that we shouldn't use it as our guiding North Star.
All right. 4 minutes, correct? Okay. All right. I'll go ahead and start right now. Since it's my final speech, I do just want to go ahead and echo those thank yous again. I know that you're tired of them, but seriously, you should be thanked much more than we're already thanking you. So thank you so much to the law school. Thank you so much to our audience, to the experts that showed up, and thank you so much to Assistant Dean Watson. That being said, I'm going to give you a couple more reasons as to why you should think that the proposition has won in today's round, that why you should think the Magna Carta is still a valuable guide. The first reason, and I think the first major reason, is that it and it alone is the source. Time and time again, the opposition has tried to get up and tell you that, well, Magna Carta didn't invent due process. We don't have to say that, right? Or that Magna Carta isn't the first to guarantee it or to set it up in some sort of written form. We're not telling you that. But what we are telling you is that this is the first document that gives force to these rights. It is the first document that guarantees these rights. It is the first document that sets up the law, not just as a suggestion, but as a supreme ruler that can never be toppled, that can never be violated, that can never be disagreed with. And it is that which gives force to that law. It not only establishes it as a supreme ruler of the land, the law, of course, but it gives force behind it. It allows for enforcement. That is something that no other charter, no matter whether my opponents continue to make these hazy gestures towards the Tang codes or the Hammurabi codes, that cannot be matched in its authority or in its strength. My opponents tell you that these other codes, well, they write it down, or they say that kings should follow these charters. but they do not give you the same kind of authority, the same kind of enforcement. No other charter does. That's why we all decided to come to this one very place and talk about it. The next thing, of course, is legitimacy. Not only did enforcement matter, but of course, it allowed for the supremacy of the law. That is why we have such debates about this. The second major reason is that it's a treaty extraordinaire, right? My opponents want to continue talking about how this is a peace treaty. It's not some sort of treatise on government, but that doesn't matter. Whether or not the actual document is a treaty, it led to other things. It is the tree of liberty that every other branch has thus far grown from. That's why it's important. And in fact, I would argue that the fact that it is a treaty gives it more force. The fact that any king was brought to his knees to actually have to obey the rights of his subjects is extremely important and something that we should carry on today. But not only that, but it covers much ground. It establishes things such as freedom of navigation. It goes beyond the realm of a regular peace treaty. And the barons weren't just advocating for themselves, they advocate for so many, many other people that are below their rule. Freemen aren't just barons, or else they would have just written that in the document. They're people who own land, who aren't slaves, and who live in the country. And as we acknowledge, that's not all-encompassing. That leads us to our third and final point. The Magna Carta has inspiring problems. It's something that we can continue to look back to and give credence to and figure out whether or not we're honoring the spirit of. And when we find lapses and shortcomings in the document, rather than them being problems that prevent us from having such great things as universal human rights or protections for every single American, we decide to expand on the Charter, to enforce its actual mission, to continue to follow what it did for us. That's why we think it's still a valuable guide, because despite what my opponents tell you, it still guides us. It still is the original source of liberty, and it still will guide us in the future. Thank you all so very much.
All right, 4 minutes. Is everybody ready? I'll begin now. You'll be happy to know that this is the last 4 minutes. You as the judges will get to decide who has won, and we will get to go explore Cambridge for a little bit. But I'd like to tell you just a couple of final things about the Magna Carta. Now, I know I've been forced to take the side of the pessimists. There are a lot of experts on the Magna Carta, two of the most prominent. They probably don't like me, but you should at the end of this speech. Fundamentally, there is an important lesson to be learned from the Magna Carta, a historical one. When Devin asked me, what does the Bible say about cryptocurrency, I said, I don't know. When Devin asked me what the Bill of Rights says about cryptocurrency, I said, I don't know. But why did I say that? Because we wasn't asking the right question. How do we constrain governmental power? And that's the thesis of what you should be thinking about right now. How does the Magna Carta constrain governmental power? What sort of guidance can it offer to us? And I say virtually none. Now, it's a very important document because maybe we credit it with establishing these principles, but establishing them isn't enough. What's my thesis? Just because you're the ancestor to something valuable does not make you yourself valuable. And that's what you need to understand about the opposition. The Magna Carta is historically valuable, and understanding its development is key. It is important. What was its development? It's a story of change. When the Magna Carta was first issued, and I don't even think the two experts in this room, or the many experts in this room will disagree with me here, but it was not meant to change the foundation of law or be prescient for all time. It was a peace treaty. It was for a group of elite land-owning individuals to benefit themselves. And in 1217, after that, it was slightly more. It was a peace treaty not offered by the barons, but from the king. And then in 1300, after that, it was more expansive. It included a parliament and a right to petition the king. And after that, when used by Sir Edward Coke, it was even more. It was the foundation for individual rights. Why does this evolution matter? Because it shows us that the Magna Carta lacks an identity, or at least the identity it had at the beginning. It's okay for documents to develop, and that's the central thesis of humankind. We shouldn't refer back to the Magna Carta today because it doesn't tell us anything useful. We already know that due process is important. That's why we enshrined it in the Fifth Amendment. We know that everyone should have rights. That's why we try our best to practice it. The question isn't what should our core values be. We've already written those down in our own documents which you can see here whenever you want. The question is, how do we attain them specifically? We live in an ever more complex world. We're not legislating about fish weirs anymore, as much as that would be interesting. Today, we're asking about AI, cryptocurrency, nuclear weapons, things that are important, and we're dealing with presidents that maybe or don't maybe dislike due process. We have to ask ourselves the tough questions. When are we going to refer back to the Magna Carta? And the answer is we're not. When we talk about due process today, it shouldn't be the question of, do we have due process? Okay, yes, we've already decided on that one. But it's how specifically to have a good enforcement mechanism. That enforcement mechanism may be the most important thing that the proposition talked about, and it's basically non-existent under the Magna Carta. And that, too, is part of its long legacy. The two clauses, 16 and 61, that ensure that we would be able to enforce the Magna Carta were long removed. And what does that tell us? That a king can do whatever they want. But then they were used anyway. And what does that tell us? That might makes right. At the end of the day, it's not good for the strong to have all of the power. At the end of the day, following the lessons of the Magna Carta lets us know that we should revolt whenever we don't like something. We need to learn a more important one. Just because you're the ancestor of something valuable does not make you yourself valuable. In the modern day, when we're trying to answer more complex questions, we need to look to more recent documents. In 100 years, maybe the US Constitution won't be so important anymore. Maybe we'll have fractured into small nations. Here's hoping not, but you never know. And at that point, maybe the US Constitution won't be a valuable guide. As we evolve as a society with ever-changing needs, with ever-changing people, with ever-changing languages and demographics, we have to reassess what our needs are. The Magna Carta was written more than 800 years ago, and it is no doubt legendary important. But does it serve as an important guide? No. The political landscape is different now. The most important guide is the one that's relevant, the one that reflects the values of the day, and the one that does it specifically. Not the one that just tells us there should be due process, but the one that tells us how we get it done. Thank you very much.
We're going to have one more treat for you, and I'm going to put my good friends, David Carpenter and Nicholas Vincent, just to ask you if you'll give a quick response, non-technical, and only kind and generous, to say thank you to our debaters who've worked so hard for you today.
Well, first of all, I just want to say how tremendously impressed I am by your debating skills, but also by your knowledge. And I think as great barristers, you've got up a subject about which presumably you knew very little before you started and seemed to me to know it very well. And I only wish some of my students writing essays on Magna Carta could have done as well as you. I'm not going to take sides in the debate. I thought very, very good points were made on both sides. Just make a few quick points. The comparison was made between Magna Carta and the Coronation Charter of Henry I, and that's valid in a way because you're quite right. The barons in 1215 cited the Coronation Charter of 1100 and appealed to it. But I think there was a huge and fundamental difference in that the Coronation Charter is a comparatively brief document compared to Magna Carta, which is 3,500 words, 61 chapters, and covers a very much broader range of government. And so, you know, it's much more nitty-gritty, a series of do's and don'ts. Now, on the other hand, I think you're absolutely right, the opposition, to focus on the whole question of enforcement. And you're quite right, too, to say that after the security clause was dropped, after 1215, there was no constitutional way of enforcing the charter other than the church excommunicating violators. And it's perfectly true that under the Statute of Marlborough in the mid-13th century, you could sue out a writ if you felt the charter was being broken. And that was sometimes done, but it wasn't done all that often. So I think, you know, there were constant complaints that the charter was being broken. But I'd add another qualification to that, which is that, of course, the charter does become very, very well known. And the statute books here at Harvard Law School show it was copied again and again and again. So its detailed provisions were very well known. And in a way, that gave a sort of moral force to their to obedience to them. And I think there was a feeling there were some very key chapters that if they were blatantly broken, because people knew they were being broken, there would be trouble. And that, I think there was a distinct before and after as a result. The justice was not sold in the same way. The inheritance tax of a baron does become £100, a huge difference, with thousands of pounds were charged before. And actually it was very important for women in that noble women were no longer forced into remarriage. So it does have some very major effects. So I'm not sure where that leaves us, and I haven't commented at all on where it is today. From that point, I'm going to hand over to my esteemed colleague, Professor Vincent.
Thank you very much. I echo everything David said there, and the hope for the future is that there will be plenty of people like you who are capable of debating these ideas with the sophistication that you showed there. I thought that was absolutely marvelous. On due process, I'm reminded of the 1936 Soviet constitution that guarantees due process, subject to the regulation by the Presidium of the Soviet Union, which of course means that due process means many things to many people. There is due process in North Korea, but it's not necessarily the due process that we recognize. This is a rights-based land, the US, we the people, and that idea of constitutional liberty is central to everything that matters to us in the West, I think is one that needs to be championed. And whether we do that through Magna Carta or not is really neither here nor there. But perhaps a point that was made earlier on, we talked about it as the pole star, and it's quite true that the pole star contains a lot of matter, and a lot of that matter doesn't matter very much, but at least it's there. So thank you very much indeed for a most enlightening afternoon.
Thank you very much.
I think that means you all won. Congratulations. And I think we're actually the winners here, and thank you all so much.